Welcome to PIP, Mikayla and Dayna.
Hello.
Hi. Very excited. Dayna, she's back.
I'm back.
Second episode.
They wanted more.
Yeah.
They wanted more.
Yeah. It didn't really give you a chance. You just you're back in the hot
Straight
seat.
in.
And this time we've got Mikayla.
First time.
First time. We're very excited. We've got a really cool topic today. We are speaking mealtimes, feeding, all those kinds of things. But we've asked Mikayla to be here because you recently completed, was it 5 days?
It was 5 days, yeah.
5-day PD. What was it?
It was the SOS PD,
Yeah.
which was awesome.
So if you're familiar with feeding, which I'm guessing if you're listening, you've got some kind of interest or are familiar with feeding type goals, the SOS is one quite heavily evidence-based intervention.
Yeah.
But we're not only going to speak on SOS today, but it was timely because you did that a couple of months back and we thought, let's pick your brains.
Definitely.
Yeah. So when we're speaking about mealtimes and that kind of thing, I suppose we are very well aware that we are OTs here and this is a podcast for OTs but also for other clinicians. So we will speak to, I suppose, what we think our role is in this space and how we work with families to work on mealtimes and feeding goals, but we will also speak to, I suppose, when we think it's not our role as well. But from both of your ends, when we have families walk through the doors to Kid Link and sit down in your intake and say, look, I've got concerns about my child's feeding or I want some support around how mealtimes look, what do we generally want to know from families? What helps us form those goals for them and informs our therapy?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I feel like there's actually like so much to it, and in our intakes you only really get like a little snapshot of what's happening. But I generally want to know straight away what type of foods they're eating, how much they're eating as well, where they're eating, where it's tricky, is it in all spaces, is it only some? Those are some of the ones that stand out straight away.
And because I suppose there's a really hard line for therapists to figure out as well what is typical fussy eating or picky eating, because we do know developmentally that toddlers in particular, like that's incredibly normal for them to have fussy eating.
And the up and down,
patterns.
like the progressions and the regression.
Foods come and go. And, you know, one night I present a meal to my 3-year-old twins and they're like, this is yummy. And then the next night they're like, I don't want this. Like, oh, man. So it's like when we're working with families, it's hard for them to also sometimes distinguish between what should I tell the OT as
is
well?
this a goal for us or
what am
not?
I concerned about, or is it something I should be concerned about as well? What about you, Dayna? What kinds of things do you also want to know about?
I guess as well as what Mika said, I typically ask a lot of questions about what those mealtimes look like. Yeah. And I guess we'll get into a bit more detail, the difference between mealtimes and eating or feeding practice. Yeah. We'll talk on that a little bit more. But, you know, I know mealtimes can look so different and individual from family to family. Like some like to sit on the couch in front of the TV and eat. Do they eat at a table with everyone together, or their meals super like staggered with the family members throughout the day? And I think that's really important to consider, those environmental factors as well as how sensory preferences might play into it as well. So that's typically kind of where I go to with it as well.
I really like to reflect on that as a now adult, I suppose, thinking about when I'm supporting families and particularly around the meal times and what their goals might be and that kind of thing. Because growing up, I definitely had we had a lot of rules around meal times and what that meant and looked like, whether that be the no elbows on the table rule or we weren't allowed to sing at the table. And it's funny
Good
because
luck with that.
Well, yes, because
Katie's our little singer.
For those who don't know, previously before I was an OT, I sung a lot and taught children and that kind
really
of thing.
Just Right challenge for you, Katie.
I know, but it's actually really funny because my sister used to hum all the time when she would eat. And now being an OT, I know that was probably a regulation strategy for her. But it's funny because, there was this rule at our table that we weren't allowed to sing at the table, and we'd need to wait to be excused or asked to be excused.
I used to find that really hard because I always had the rule of you eat everything off your plate and then you can go do something. But and you guys would know I'm very much a movement seeker. I cannot sit still. I remember dreading dinner time because I went, I cannot sit still. And it would be, I just want to go roll down over there and then come back. But it was like, no, you eat first and then you can do your plate. And I was like, but I can't. I can't. It's too hard.
Absolutely. So there's that like balance of knowing how that can, at least now as a clinician, I feel like now I can take that step back and go, okay, well, what could that actually mean for a child that does have, like certain sensory needs in relation to meal times or regulation needs and that kind of thing? Or how might that present in terms of stress around meal times as well? What about you, Mick? Did you have any particular family-based routines or rules around meal times that you think
definitely
have shaped things for you?
Definitely. It was always, if you wanted dessert, you had to finish what was on your plate, which again, I actually didn't grow up thinking that was, the biggest issue ever. But now I'm looking at it like, I guess from like a interoception point of view, like knowing when you're full and that side of things. And I think if I didn't become an OT, I wouldn't be educated on some of those different things. And again, just I guess like behaviour around the dinner table, like you chew with your mouth closed. Again, elbows on the table, like get them off, sitting still, all of
not
those
on your
sort
knees,
of things.
that kind of thing.
No,
it's also funny, like coming back to the no dessert until you finish what's on your plate, because like we as now educated clinicians know, like we really want to try and avoid like putting certain foods on a pedestal and that kind of thing. And it's so hard. And I'm now thinking about it as with my parent hat on. Like it's so hard to not, like when you've got food that you've prepared and they're just like pushing it around and then you're like, do you want a Freddo after dinner? It's like to stop yourself from doing that. But then they're like, ooh, the Freddo, I like the Freddo. Like, okay, I'll eat.
It's like so much on family values as well. And I guess like at the end of the day, like what the goal is the goal, I guess, engagement in the actual meal time. Is it like consumption of a broad range of foods, or is it actually the amount that they're eating? Because perhaps like weight and things are actually a challenge. So I think it can be tricky to sort of decide what way to go about it.
I certainly can remember quite a few years ago I had a young boy on my caseload, and yes, probably goals needed to be more aligned with food intake and like weight and nutrition and that kind of thing. He was your classic beige diet and very, very specific brands and shapes of food and that kind of thing. But mum just wanted him to sit at the table for a meal time. And I remember working with this family for a really long period of time, and what we came to learn about this child was, I mean, I don't think I ever saw him stand still for more than 0.5 of a second. So sitting at the table was never going to be a just right challenge. But we ended up like eventually to get him increasing the food intake was that we really tried to, and I really tried to support the family to understand that his sensory needs needed to kind of come first. He needed to be regulated to allow his body to be hungry as well. But in the end, it was like he was watching TV with the weighted blanket on in a ball pit to eat food.
And I guess like when eating or meal times are tricky and you're thinking about like what you said, then appetite and regulation comes first. Even if I think about how many times I eat across the day and if that was stressful, I would be stressed all the time because I guess like our days are framed even at school or as adults around work around your lunch break or socially meal times. So it is such a big topic and it's like, where do I start?
And I think that's another, like we said earlier, like it's a huge part of that parent education is the level of stress that a child might feel during it. Like what do we know about stress and eating?
I guess the first thing I think of is, well, I know stress and anxiety often gets used interchangeably, but I know for a lot of my kids, anxiety is a lot of what they feel in that moment with eating. But if your body is in that fight, flight or freeze response, it becomes very challenging to do anything in terms of like, especially taking on a demand that we put on them to do with something as stressful and anxiety inducing as eating. We actually need to calm the nervous system and do something to support the body to feel safe and actually engage with what we're asking them to do. And eating is no different to that. I guess puts into perspective why regulation is so important at those times, because it's not, we can't expect them to do that.
And when we've had such like restricted diet for a period of time and that kind of thing, where like I've certainly had families where they're like, I know you're saying stress, Caitlin, but like it's just a cucumber that I'm putting on the plate. But unfortunately that cucumber is a new food. It's got lots of different kind of sensory properties to it in terms of how it looks, how it feels. It's wet, it's cold, that kind of thing. And sometimes families aren't actually putting it on the plate with anything else that's safe. So it does cause stress for our kids.
And also for the parents. I have a lot of families like share, I guess, their experiences where they're describing how stressful mealtimes can be from one perspective of being that it's just a bit chaotic and they, you know, managing, I guess, behaviours around the dinner table or whatever their mealtime looks like is hard. But then on the other hand, it's like stress in terms of like my kid won't eat. You know, they might not be getting, like we said before, or meeting their nutrient, I guess, levels and things like that. So there's a whole other side to it where it is stressful, and building on that even more, I guess, like going to family events when perhaps grandparents or aunties and uncles or friends and family don't have the education that perhaps the family is getting from OT.
And why aren't they eating? Like I made them this meal.
Just one more bite. And so there's stress not only at meal times at home, but I guess I think it expands onto other environments as well.
And things like I've had like upper primary school kids where we've had feeding goals, where things like camp as well. It's like, how am I going to go to camp? I can't eat those foods. Like I need my safe foods. And so it is a lot of navigating lots of different factors when you're working on mealtimes goals. Why? Because I suppose as clinicians, we often have our like special interest areas or areas that we prefer to, like we're like, I love working on handwriting goals or parent education. But I feel like I'm in an okay position to ask you, Mikayla, in particular. I know that you do like mealtimes goals. Why do you like it?
I think it probably stems from like me just really liking food.
That's fair.
It's valid. But I think, again, sort of what I said before around like the whole day being structured around food as adults and for kids. Again, you have your recess, your lunch, your brain food. There are so many demands with food. You just have to put on the TV and there's advertising around food at you. Walk down the street. It's kind of everywhere. So I feel like when families come in and they're speaking about their child who is experiencing lots of dysregulation and then they mention mealtimes or picky eating, I sort of view it as like that could be actually something that is having more impact or your child is thinking about more than perhaps we realise. So I think sometimes it is a really nice place to start and it's very practical. I like as well. Like family has really clear things that they can go home and do, which often helps with the implementation of strategies from the clinic to at home as well. What about you, Dayna?
I was going to say, I think it's the practical aspect that I really like, as well as I think it really does highlight how much we need to consider regulation and in particular sensory preferences. I think I really enjoy sort of supporting families or I guess coaching to a degree, like that aspect of why is this so important and how can it look? But like you said, I think getting into session and modelling a feeding practice session I really enjoy, and sort of modelling food play or playing with food and showing families, I guess, a different way to look at it. And I guess even that understanding as well that eating is actually a skill, and I think we sometimes forget that. It's just like how a child might learn to walk. There's steps that come before that, and I think we often
we have like
jump. to that.
like physiological mechanisms that develop and not always as we'd hope, but generally like, you know, we learn to somewhat chew and swallow and that kind of thing. But the actual skill of eating foods and being around food.
Particularly if there's a stress response involved.
Yeah.
Like it needs to be handled very differently and approached with a sense of, understanding and trust and vulnerability and all those things.
Yeah.
I
also find that mealtimes and feeding goals, there's lots of little wins.
Yeah.
Definitely.
You know, it's
So
you
true.
can set some really like short-term goals that honestly sometimes are between 2 sessions, like a fortnight where they're like, you know, we moved that food up the ladder, you know, 1 or 2 steps. And, you know, we went from not being able to even look at it on the other side of the room to being able to look at it through a container or like and teaching parents that they are wins. I think that's really cool because for some other goal areas you don't get to celebrate such small wins so often.
Or as tangible, I guess.
Yes,
and to the
and
child,
it makes
to see
a real functional impact for families usually
it's something
as well.
that like we have to do.
Yeah.
I guess if you're looking at want to do, need to do, have to do.
Yeah.
We have to do it for our whole lives.
Yes.
It's always going to be an occupation, you could say, that we have to engage in. So I think that's really important.
It's also cool to see like child be motivated by that as well. Yeah. To acknowledge as well that those little steps are wins.
did it.
And you did it. Yeah.
So I suppose we have kind of touched on it a little bit, but difference between feeding and meal times. What is it? Where might we work on one and not the other? What does that look like?
I guess I always like to encourage families when I'm setting up that understanding to consider for meal times their values and sort of what they sort of see meal times to look like. Like we said, sometimes on the couch in front of the TV or sometimes all together at the table, but it's individual, it's different. The focus is not trying new foods or building exposure, I guess, of that, eating unsafe or different foods, but it's getting food into the body and that being that safe setting. Feeding practice is still a safe setting, but it's for that exploration of trying new foods, feeding practice, and supporting the child to develop their skills in that setting. That's kind of how I like to think of it.
How do you explain it?
Very similar. And I almost think of it a little bit like, if your kid engages in a sport, like doing the training, like footy training during the week versus playing the game. Footy training is where you learn the skill, and I guess the game is where you just practice it and use the skills that you already have to be able to actually go and do that. So I like to view it that way as well. But I guess the only thing to add that feeding practice is really about, like you said, reducing stress and creating a safe space to learn about new foods in a very controlled way. And depending on the age, I guess it can be really play-based, or if they're older and I guess they want to be choosing the foods that they want to learn about, that's the place to do it without having to compromise, I guess, calm meal time if that's
like
the goal.
some kind of environmental factor in that as well. So we have acknowledged, I suppose, that we are OTs, and this isn't just a space that OTs work in as well. So yes, we work a lot on like the feeding practice in terms of looking at stress response and emotional regulation and that kind of thing in that moment. We look at our like sensory preferences around foods and that kind of thing. Where do you guys feel, and it could be different, you could have a different answer, I suppose, in terms of just your level of experience as an individual clinician, but where do you start to feel, I think I need to refer on or get somebody else's input, or I can work on this but I can't work on that element? That kind of thing.
I guess I can speak to, and it does depend on the client, but I guess when I've had families bring up maybe they've got a diagnosis of something like ARFID or eating disorders, that's when I then kind of go, look, I actually think that that's where having your psych on board, pediatrician and all them aware before we start to look at these goals, because they are, quite... in terms of what we're qualified to do, there are a lot more weighty and there's a lot more that anxiety that underpins that is, I guess, beyond sort of what we would typically sort of work on in that sort of environment.
And those kinds of diagnoses generally require medical intervention as well, and really close observation of
we don't want to
the child's food intake and that kind of thing. Yes. So absolutely, I would agree that I've had clients before where kind of we've been bordering on that, like where's the line of like restricted diet versus ARFID as well, and when do we need to make sure that we're engaged with like eating disorder clinics or psychologists or dietitians as well and that kind of thing. What about you, Mick?
Yeah, I'm thinking the kids that I usually see, again, it's a lot of the time around like picky eating, fussy eating, and I would say in terms of like referring to a speech therapist, a lot of the time they already have someone on board, which is great. But I would say we can do an oral motor skill screener, which I think is really beneficial to figure out, I guess, again, it could be one of the reasons why mealtimes or eating is tricky. I often like to collaborate with the speech though and get videos if the family is happy to, and then look at it together and actually think about what impact it might be having. Same with the dietitian, getting their input on, I guess, if we're going to introduce any foods, where do you think we should start, and getting their idea on that as well.
And sometimes I think it's important to also be supporting families to know the care team that they have in place, to make sure that they're the care team that they need as well. Like they might have a speechy on board, for example, but that speechy might be like have a special interest in literacy, for example, and might not feel as confident looking at like feeding assessment and oral motor and that kind of thing as well. So looking at the care team and thinking about how do we make sure that those supports that we need are in place happens.
Definitely.
As well.
Also, like just finding out some information from the paediatrician, or even just like the GP, like where are the nutrition levels at, just to inform what's happening, and also like measuring progress. You can look at it from that perspective as well.
When we talk about progress, because I know it's like we said earlier, it can be a really cool goal to have in terms of small wins, but it can also be a really long-term goal as well. What are some wins for you that you've had that with your clients that you're like, yes, that was like a huge moment for that kid and their feeding?
I've got a couple that come to mind. I had this one little girl, and she ate a strawberry, and we'd been learning about chewing it, and she could spit it out. And this one day she could see on her steps to eating, she was very motivated to move it up. She was going to swallow it. Again, really low pressure. It was up to her, and she swallowed it. And there's a lot of discussion around whether we react to these sort of things. For this little girl, she was so excited.
If you're following the child's lead there.
Absolutely. And we cheered, and she was jumping up and down, and she was like, I love strawberries now. It was amazing. I even had a family yesterday tell me that her daughter recently said, like, I don't really want to be a food explorer, but she went and got sushi, and then suddenly she was like, I'm going to be a food explorer, and she licked a little piece of salmon and she ate it, and then she was like, I like this now. And it wasn't during like their specific feeding practice. It wasn't during meal times, but mum was like, it is actually starting to
seep into the routines.
And she's starting to understand like why we're actually learning about this.
It's really cool.
What about you guys?
Similar to your last one, Mick, I'm just thinking about a little girl that I was working on feeding practice within session. She found it really hard to even sort of look. The visual presentation of food was really tricky for her. Like if it didn't look right, it was really hard for her to engage. So just trying new foods was really difficult. But with the expectation of coming to feeding practice being really clear that this is just us exploring and these are our steps, and we had our chart, she was engaging that in feeding practice really, really well. And we're also finding, I think, the timing of our sessions being after school meant, and this is probably another point, it being she was hungry. So she was more likely to be interested and engaging. She was always she'd sit down and she'd look at the foods presented, and she knew that the expectations were, I'm just going to either, led by her going up the steps of eating chart. And mum was saying now at home, her willingness and confidence to try new foods. She's no longer sort of looking at it and running. It's okay, like considering it, and has tried a lot of new foods recently across different settings. And I think that's been the biggest win for them, like being able to go to restaurants and not scared that she's going to run and leave the table, but actually she can sit and sort of, take that, I guess, ownership over that for herself and a bit of the lead in terms of trying those new foods in these different settings, which has been really, really cool.
Yeah, that is cool. I had a young client that I used to work with. I say young, he was actually like in the realm of feeding goals. He was older, I guess. He was like grade 3 or grade 4 at the time. Yeah. And he just had a real rough time with sitting around foods that were unsafe foods for him, but the language he would use around those foods was very much like, yuck, gross, I hate it, it's disgusting. And we just worked really hard on like sitting with a food and just describing it for its sensory properties. And I remember having a session, and I myself am a vegetarian, and the family brought in a couple of different foods, and salami was one. So I was like, oh, like first of all, I'm like, I don't love the smell of salami. It's pretty strong. But I was like, this is a really good opportunity for me to show that you don't have to eat a food to still explore a food. Yeah. And we talked a lot about like, how it looks and what temperature it is when we touch it with our fingers. It's actually a lot harder than it actually sounds. Is. Yeah. It's so tricky. It's so funny when we do like...
There's only so many adjectives I can use.
Yeah, and when we do explorative sessions with foods and stuff, I'm always like, bring these kinds of foods, and then when they get there, I'm like, so I can't actually eat that one. Yeah. Sorry. But it's a really great way of kind of modelling how we can explore it in different ways. But it got to the point where like this young child could actually just sit there and be like, it's slimy, and not necessarily associate slimy with negative, or it was wet, or it was cold, or that kind of thing. And I was like, you know what? That's a small win for this kid. Yeah. Actually quite a big win.
Yeah, and I like that you brought that up, because I guess now like my own goals in like, I guess, being an OT is really trying to refine mealtime goals and what they look like, because you can say to a family like, this is going to be a really long term, it's slow, but for all those examples that you guys just gave, you can really break it up so that they can come back after 2 weeks and actually report some progress. I think it's just about the language that we write our goals in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that might allow us to kind of stop. I feel like if we dive too much into kind of how we do intervention, it could be another 45 minutes.
And assessment.
So maybe we might do a more tailored how we as OTs assess and intervene, I guess. But I think it's been a really cool chat around just our thoughts around mealtimes and what we love about working on that and the challenges and that kind of thing. So
how different those goals can look.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that mealtimes is one of those things, quite like toileting, where they just have to be so individualized, those goals, and really looking at where is the family and the child at, which can be really fun as well. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me. Katie. I hope you both come back. Mikayla, I hope we haven't scared you off.
No, I'm ready for part 2.
Yeah. Woohoo. All right. Well, we'll see you then. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.